From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Neal Stephenson here today. In every way, Mr. Stephenson writes big books. As many of you know, they're big in the literal sense, as most of his books are the size of car batteries. His books are epics whose roots can be traced back to Moby Dick or Lord of the Rings, and they're fueled by big ideas. He makes us consider the very nature of philosophy, language, security, technology, and society. And they're propelled with plot points and characters as far-ranging as a clock that runs for thousands of years. Code making and viruses, hackers and monks and mathematicians, Russian mobsters and metaphysics. Whether they're science fiction fantasies or intense, spine-tingling thrillers, in Neal Stephenson's books, which sometimes span a century or more, everything in our cosmos is fair game. And despite the remarkable scopes of his books, whose ambitions make most novelists quiver, Neal Stephenson is very much a storyteller in the grand tradition of Charles Dickens and Alexander Dumas. His characters aren't just cogs that make his ingenious plots go, but vividly imagined and fully realized people with genuine and often poignant backstories. His vast readership is always eager for the next, often otherworldly adventure, and Neal never disappoints. He's the author of the 3-volume historical epic, The Baroque Cycle, which includes Quicksilver, The Confusion, and The System of the World, and the novels Cryptonomicon, The Diamond Age, Snow Crash, Zodiac, and Anathem. And now we have his latest novel, Reamde. We're very honored to have him with us this afternoon, so please welcome to the stage Neal Stephenson.
Thank you. Head for the microphones, because I was a silly man, and I didn't bring a copy of the book. So one is being procured, and when it gets here, which will probably be within a few minutes, I'm going to read from it. Normally, I would read first for a little while, and okay. Thank you. I don't know why we didn't think of that earlier. So, a lot of this book, I'm going to save your receipt, in case you have to return it. This is a thriller, and as such, a lot of it consists of people running around shooting at each other, and those parts don't make necessarily for good reading material because they contain spoilers, and because you sort of don't care about people shooting at each other unless you know them a little bit. So in the early part of the book, a lot of the material that's in here is about getting to know the characters a little bit, and so I'm going to read some stuff that helps set up who these people are. So I guess the main character, or one of the two main characters in the book, is a guy named Richard Forthrast, who grew up in northwest Iowa on a farm. His father was a World War II hero. His older brother John was drafted and served in Vietnam, and was maimed by a landmine. And Richard, not wanting to suffer a similar fate, went off to British Columbia and made a life for himself there. And it is a somewhat colorful life. And at one point, he found himself in possession of an illicitly obtained grizzly bear pelt, which is actually not that important to the story, but I have to mention it because otherwise part of the reading won't make much sense. Later on, Richard parlays his ill-gotten gains into a legitimate business, and when that succeeds, he becomes very, very bored for a while, plays a lot of video games, and starts a kind of second or third career by launching a video game company. The name of the company is Corporation 9592, and the name of the game is Terrain. And the terrain has some staff writers who are major fantasy novelists hired for the job, one of whom is derisively known by the nickname of Skeletor. And that's all kind of background stuff that you have to know in order for this reading to make sense. So we join the action on the day after Thanksgiving. Richard's been at a family reunion in Iowa at the family farm, and he is going to leave now, and he's going to go drive down to Missouri, which is where Skeletor lives, and meet with them. And then after that, he's going to go to the Isle of Man, which is where the other author lives, and talk to him. Richard awoke and made efforts to silence his phone, only to find that the local climate had sucked all moisture out of his fingertips, which could not obtain virtual purchase on the tiny affordances of its user interface. Through some combination of licking and breathing on his fingers, he was able to get them damp enough that the machine now grudgingly recognized them as human flesh, responded to his commands, and became silent. He groped for his reading glasses and tapped the calendar button. A green slab rushed out of the darkness and made his white chest hairs glow in viridian thickets. His eyes came into focus and read its label, Road Trip, Skeletor. Zooming out to a longer time scale, he saw good color omens, no red at all for the next fortnight, and 4 solid days of green, the color of business, coming up. Blue was the color of family and other personal activities. Yesterday, for example, had been a 16-hour blue tombstone labeled Reunion. Following Road Trip Skeletor were other enormous green slabs labeled to IOM, which, as Richard knew only too well, was the airport code for the Isle of Man, then Pay Fealty D2, and finally to SEA. Red was for things like medical appointments and doing his taxes. A week that was even lightly spattered with red was pretty much a write-off when it came to getting anything accomplished. Blue wasn't as bad as red, but it did tend to infiltrate neighboring regions of green and mulch them. Rare indeed were the moments when blue time could be converted to green. For example, yesterday when he had realized that his niece Zula ought to be working for Corporation 9592. Waking up in green mode, then spending the whole day there was really the only way to get anything done. So color physics now dictated that he must steal out of the hotel without having any interactions whatsoever with the reunion crowd that would already have filled the Ramada's breakfast room and spilled over into the lobby. He checked out over the phone and stood in perfect silence, eyeball to peephole, until he could no longer see miniature Forthrasts in bathing suits going to or from the pool. He then stole out of the motel through a side exit and gunned the Grand Marquis to a gas station half a mile down the road just to get decisively clear. He pumped a bathtub load of gasoline into the thing and bought a cup of coffee and a banana for the road. He fired up the car's onboard GPS device and began coping with its user interface. The Possum Walk trailer court was no longer listed in its points of interest database, so he had to settle for browsing the greater Nottoway region of northwestern Missouri. Expecting to see nothing more than a post office and maybe a county park, he was dismayed and fascinated when it hurled up a low-res icon of a pointy-eared humanoid with long blue braids labeled Kshetriya Kingdom. Further browsing informed him that it was part of a larger Kshetriya-themed complex that included an amusement park and a retail outlet. He could not bring himself to choose this as his destination and coyly allowed the machine to vector him to the county seat. On his way out of town, deeply preoccupied with the fact that the ersatz quasi-elven race known as the Kshetriya were now embedded, though sans the controversial apostrophe, in the memory chips of real-world GPS systems, he almost plowed into the back of what passed for a traffic jam around here, Black Friday shoppers trying to force-feed their vehicles into the parking lot and their bodies through the doorway of Walmart. In olden days, he would have pumped the brakes judiciously, bringing the enormous vehicle to a stop, but nowadays he knew that this could be outsourced to anti-lock brakes, so he just crushed the pedal to the floor and waited. The pedal thrummed beneath his foot. The white plastic teat of his go-cup discharged a globule of coffee, and his banana boomeranged into the glove compartment lid. He watched dispassionately as the tailgate of a pickup truck grew huge in his windshield, not unlike a calendar item zooming onto the screen of his phone. No collision occurred. The driver gave him the finger. A light changed and traffic seeped forward. Soon enough, he was on the interstate, southbound. That rapidly grew boring, so he switched to two-lane roads to the mounting chagrin of his GPS. In spite of his cloak and dagger exit from the Reamde, his brain was jammed with family stuff. He had woken up in the wrong color. He had to get all traces of blue out of his mind and achieve full greenness before he got anywhere near the Iowa-Missouri line. For this was not just a friendly meeting. Nuances in today's conversation, things left unsaid or said in the wrong way, could have expensive consequences. The day after Thanksgiving might have been time off for most of the country, but not for Skeletor. The parochial turkey-eating customs of the United States were of no interest at all to the hyper-international clientele that he and Richard shared. And even their American players, though they might have taken a few hours off yesterday for family observances, would be devoting most of today to questing for virtual gold and vicarious glory in the world of terrain, making this one of the heaviest days of the year for Corporation 9592's servers and the system administrators who kept them running. But his mind kept drifting into the blue. It was like a puzzle in a video game. He had to figure out what was really bothering him. It wasn't the furious muses. After a brief howl of outrage when he'd almost rear-ended the pickup truck, they had been silent for hours. Somewhere around Red Oak, he finally put it together. It was yesterday's short but uneasy exchange with the Wikipedia reading in-law. The actual content of Richard's Wikipedia entry was not at issue. What bothered Richard was the mere fact that such a thing existed and that he had been abruptly reminded of it at a moment when he just wanted to be Dodge, hanging around the old place. The entry in question started with a summary of what Richard was now, and it filled in biographical details only when they seemed relevant to whatever mysterious stalker scholars compiled such documents. He was not important enough, and the entry was insufficiently long to include a biographical section laying out the whole story in narrative form, which seemed all wrong to him, since the only way to make sense of what he was now was to tell the story of how he'd gotten that way. When he had lugged that bearskin down the Selkirk crest, he had done so without a plan, without even a motive, and certainly without a map. The ridges were steep and rocky. The sun shone on them like a torch. No water sprang from them. Attempts to descend into the cool-looking valleys were baffled by the density of the vegetation, called dog fir by the few people who actually lived in those parts, apparently because it made the hiker know what it must be like to be a flea navigating a dog's hindquarters. Half out of his mind with hunger and exhaustion, he traversed a long talus slope that ramped down into the remnants of a dead silver mine, then descended through a belt of dog fir and, surprisingly, into a grove of ancient cedar trees. Decades later, he would learn the term microclimate. At the time, he just felt that he had stepped through a wormhole to a damp and chilly rainforest perched above the Pacific. The canopy was so dense as to choke off the energy supply to everything beneath it, and so the place was mercifully free of undergrowth, and a brook ran through the middle of it from a spring farther up the slope. Maybe it was just heat stroke and low blood sugar, but he felt something holy. He flung off his pack and sat down in the creek and let its cold water explore his clothes, lay down on his back, gasped at the cold, rolled over on his stomach, and drank. His fantasy that he was the first human ever to set foot in the place was shattered moments later when he noticed, just a few yards from the stream, the foundations of an old one-room cabin. It was currently occupied by the wreckage of its own roof. Rot and carpenter ants had reduced it to a splintery mulch that he raked out with his bare hands until a cold slicing sensation told him he had just cut his finger on something unnaturally sharp. Investigating more carefully after he'd bandaged the cut, he found a crate of whiskey that had been crushed into shards by the collapse of the roof. He had inadvertently followed an old whiskey smuggling trail from Prohibition days. This cabin had been used as a cache by bootleggers. What worked for whiskey ought to work as well for marijuana, and he made a business out of that for a few years, sometimes traveling solo, other times as part of a pedestrian caravan. He showed them the bootlegger's shack, and they used it as their base camp in the United States. Half a mile down the slope was a logging road where they would rendezvous with their U.S. distributors, a sodality of motorcycling enthusiasts. In 1977, President Carter granted amnesty to draft dodgers, so Richard, finally free to do business in his own country under his own name, crossed the border in an actual vehicle for a change and drove down the valley to Bourne's Ford, the county seat where the records were kept. He found the owner of the property where the cabin stood, and he bought it for cash. Though this was exactly the kind of subtlety that the Wikipedian herd mind could be relied on to trample, there was much about his later life that could be traced back to the obsession with land that had come over him when he first walked into that cool grove. In the fullness of time, he came to understand that it probably had something to do with the farm in Iowa and his knowing, even at that age, that whatever Dad's last will and testament said, however things were handled after his father's eventual demise, he wasn't going to be part of it. If he wanted to own land, he'd have to go out and find some. And it might be better and more beautiful land than the farm in Iowa could ever be, but it would never be the same. It would always be a place of exile. He fancied for a few years in the late 1970s that he would one day build a cabin on the bank of Prohibition Creek, as he had dubbed the nameless stream that flowed through his property, and live there. But it was much more comfortable north of the border, lounging on the shores of Kootenai Lake with pockets stuffed with $100 bills. And he lost his gumption for homesteading in the wilderness. So the next bit that I'm going to read happens a little bit later and concerns the niece who was mentioned earlier. This is Richard's niece, Zula, who was adopted by the family. She's Eritrean. Came over to the United States as an orphan who was adopted into the family, and she's since moved to Seattle. She's gone to work for Corporation 9592, and this passage occurs when she's in a very stressful moment. She's being asked to do something that she realizes would be a bad thing to do. Zula was very tired, and her mind was in several places at once. The word flashback was much too fraught to describe what was happening in her mind, but it was the case that the mind pulled up memories that were germane to the impressions flooding into its sensory organs, and the first few years of her life related better to what was happening now than most of what she had experienced in small-town Iowa. She did not have the energy, the clarity, or what nerds denominated the bandwidth to deal with all aspects of this situation at once. Certainly the one that dominated was the sense that she was in danger. There was a technical side to it also, but neither of those explained the sick feeling that kept passing in waves through her abdomen. There was a moral aspect to this. She'd failed to see it at all until Wallace had been sent to the other room. For that, a man like Ivanov would probably see her as ridiculously naive. She could perhaps be forgiven that naivete once. Now, though, she was being asked to give up another person, a complete stranger somewhere who had created Reamde. She had not volunteered for the job. And the Iowa girl response, of course, was always yes, especially to a polite older man in good clothes who had come such a long way. For some reason, she was remembering a moment when she had been something like 14 years old, the apex of the crystal meth epidemic in Iowa. She had been home alone and had looked out the window to see a strange van coming down the road very slowly. It had made a couple of passes by the house and then pulled into the driveway that led to their equipment shed. A couple of men had gotten out of the van, looking around nervously. Not knowing whether they might have come on some legitimate errand, Zula had made a phone call to Uncle John, as she called her second adopted dad, and Uncle John had extremely calmly talked her through the procedure of locking every door in the house, getting a shotgun and a box of shells, and hiding herself in the attic. His matter-of-fact instructions had been accompanied and sometimes drowned out by dim, roaring, screeching, and thumping noises that, as she later understood, had resulted from his driving at 100 miles an hour while he talked. Zula had barely gotten the attic stairs pulled up behind her when a lot of disturbing vehicular noises had ensued from outside, and she had peered out a gable vent to see Uncle John's car in the middle of the front yard at the end of a long set of skid marks that completely surrounded the house, for he had orbited it once, checking for signs of forced entry, and John hobbling around it on his prosthetic legs to crouch behind and use it for cover while across the way the van screamed out onto the road with a door hanging open. A cloud of what she took for steam was rising from the side of the shed where they kept the anhydrous ammonia tank. A few minutes later, the sheriff's department was there in force, and Zula felt it safe to emerge from the attic. John yelled at her that she did not have permission to come down yet. Then he hugged her and told her that she was his wonderful girl. Then he asked her about the whereabouts of the shotgun. Then he told her again how magnificent she was, and then he ordered her to go upstairs and not come out until he gave permission. She went upstairs and, peering out a window, saw what John did not want her to see: the ambulance men putting on their hazmat suits and placing a large brown wrinkled thing into a body bag. One of the thieves, startled perhaps by Uncle John's sudden advent, had made a mistake with the anhydrous ammonia line and had been sprayed with the chemical which had sucked all the water out of his body. It was in that moment, but never before and rarely since, that she had perceived a kind of subterranean through line, perhaps like one of those ley lines in terrain running from her people in Eritrea to her people in Iowa. So the last bit I'm going to read, actually first I'm going to check the time. I promise you I'm not checking my voicemail. Okay, we're doing pretty well. This is Richard again. He's on a plane. He's flying from his place in BC, which he calls the Schloss, to Seattle, to a regional airport outside of Seattle, in a private aircraft. And he has to go back because this virus called Reamde is causing havoc in their system, and he needs to go kind of figure out what's going on. Turning his attention back to matters inside the plane's cabin, Richard resumed reading the Terrain Gazette, a daily newspaper, electronic format, of course, created by a micro-department operating out of the Seattle office, which summarized what had been going on all over Terrain during the preceding 24 hours. Notable achievements: wars, duels, sackings, famines, untoward spikes in commodity prices. Torgai mortality hits 1,000,000% mark. Compiled from reports by Gazette correspondents Greshnach the Forsaken, Eric Bloodmace, and Lady Lacewing of Ferry. Torgai foothills. The mortality rate in this unexpectedly war-ravaged region today skyrocketed through 1,000,000%. Local observers attributed the unusual figure to an epochal influx of outsiders compelled by as yet unexplained astral phenomena to pay tribute to a local troll. The visitors, or as they have come to be known to locals, meat, are laden with tribute and hence make tempting targets for highwaymen. The 1,000,000% benchmark is considered by analysts to be an important psychological barrier that separates a war-ravaged inferno from a chiliastic gore storm. Steadying himself on an 8-foot wizard staff as he waded through a knee-high river of blood washing down the market street of Bagpipe Gulch, a community that once prized its status as the gateway to Torgai, Shikandar the Fearsome, a local alchemist, denied that the trend was a negative influence on the town's image, insisting that the influx of meat and the bandits, land pirates, and cutthroats who had come to prey on them had been a boon to the region's economic development and a bonanza for local merchants, especially those who, like Shikandar, dealt in goods such as healing potions and magically enhanced whetstones that were in demand among the newcomers. In the Wayfarer Inn, a popular local watering hole situated on the precipitous road leading up out of Bagpipe Gulch into the foothills, a more nuanced view of the situation could be heard in the remarks of a muffled voice barely audible through a wall of corpses stacked all the way to the taproom's ceiling and identifying itself as Goodman Bustle, the barkeep. Suggesting that all the visitors and attention might be too much of a good thing, the voice identifying itself as Bustle complained that many customers, citing as an excuse the towering rampart of decaying flesh that had completely blocked access to the bar, had departed the premises without paying their tabs. In this case, an explanatory memo supplied the information that the Torgai foothills were the turf of a band calling themselves the Da Ji Shu, probably an abbreviation of Da Gold Shu, makers of gold, where the truncation of gold to G was either due to the influence of gangsta rap or because it was easier to type. They had been running the place for years. all pretty normal. There were many little enclaves like this. Nothing in the rules prevented a sufficiently dedicated band of players from conquering and holding a stretch of ground. The meat were there because of Reamde, which had been present at background levels for several weeks now, but that had recently pinballed through the elbow in its exponential growth curve, and for about 12 hours had looked as though it might completely take over all computing power in the universe. Corvallis Kawasaki picked him up on the tarmac of the Renton airport. He was driving the inevitable Prius. "I could have had a friggin' Lincoln Town Car," Richard complained as he stuffed himself into its front seat. "Just wanted to bend your ear a little," C+ explained, fussing with the intermittent wiper knob, trying to dial in that elusive setting always so difficult to find in Seattle that would keep the windshield visually transparent but not drag shuddering blades across dry glass. They were staring straight down the runway at the southern bight of Lake Washington, which was flecked with whitecaps. It had been a choppy landing, and Richard felt a bit clammy. Corvallis had grown up in the town after which he was named, the son of a Japanese-American cog-sci professor and an Indian biotech researcher, but culturally he was pure Oregonian. No one at the company knew exactly what he did for a living, but it was hard to imagine the place without him. He shifted the Prius into gear, or whatever it was called when you pulled the lever that made it go forward, and proceeded at a safe and sane speed among the parked airplanes, dripping and rocking against their tie-downs. "I know you're going to see Devon tomorrow, and mostly what's on your mind is the war." He paused slightly before saying war, and he said it funny with a long O and heavy emphasis. "War?" Richard repeated. "WOR," C+ explained, "the War of Realignment." "Is that what the cool kids are calling it now?" "Yeah, I guess it works better in email than in conversation. Anyway, I know you're going to be prepping for that, but also you need to know that there are some interesting techno-legal issues coming up around Reamde." God, that sounds like just the can of worms that I retired to get away from. "I don't think you're actually retired," Corvallis pointed out mildly. "I mean, you just flew in from Elphinstone, and tomorrow you're taking a jet to Missouri, and from there, it's a selective retirement," Richard explained. "A retirement from boring shit." "I think that's called a promotion." "Well, whatever you call it, I don't want to drill down. Is that the expression you use?" "You know perfectly well that it is." "Into nasty details of Reamde's legal consequences. I mean, we've had viruses before, right?" "We have 281 active viruses as of the last time I checked, which was an hour ago." Richard drew breath, but C+ cut him off. "And before you go where you're going, let me just point out that most of them don't actually make use of our technology as a payment mechanism, so Reamde is not just another virus. It presents new issues because our servers are actually being used to transfer the booty." "Turns out," Corvallis warned him, "that federal law enforcement types haven't yet bought into our whole mindset, and so they aren't real big on terms like booty, swag, hoard, treasure, or anything that is evocative of a fictitious medieval armed combat scenario. To them, it's all payments, and since our system uses real money, it's all, well, real." "I always knew that that was going to swing around and bite me in the ass someday," Richard said. "I just didn't know how or when." "Well, it's bitten you in the ass lots of times, actually." "I know, but each one feels like the first." "The creator of the Reamde virus has made some interesting choices." "Interesting in a way that's bad for us?" Richard asked, because this was clearly implied by Corvallis's tone. "Well, that depends on whether we want to be the avenging sword of the Justice Department here or sort of cop out and say it's not our problem." "Go on." "The instructions in the eponymous file just state that the gold pieces are to be left at a particular location in the Torgai foothills. They do not say that the gold is to be mailed or transferred to any one specific character." "Obviously," Richard said, "because in that case we could just shut down that character's account." "Right, so the way that the virus creator takes possession of the gold is by simply picking it up off the ground where it has been dropped by the victim. The gold is scattered all over the place." "They anticipated we might make moves to shut them down," Richard said, "so they spread things out." Apparently, so it's analogous to a situation in the real world where caches of gold have been scattered all over a rugged wilderness area, hundreds of square kilometers. If that happened in the real world, Richard said, the cops would just cordon off the area. And that is exactly what cops of various nationalities are asking us to do in this case, C+ said. Just write a script that will eject or log out every character in the Torgai foothills and prevent them from logging back in. Then go in there and collect evidence. By go in there, you just mean run a program that will find all gold pieces in that region. Yes. And are we telling them to get lost? This seemed the obvious thing to do, but Richard wouldn't put anything past Corporation 9592's current CEO. We don't have any choice, C+ said. Richard was struck mute with admiration at the way C+ had answered the question while imputing nothing except helplessness to the CEO. Corvallis went on, Reamde has affected users from at least 43 different countries that we know about. If we say yes to one, we have to say yes to all of them. And then our company is being micromanaged by the United Nations, Richard said. Awesome. He was way too old to use this all-purpose adjective sincerely, but was not above throwing it into a sentence for ironic effect. The legal issues are just fantastically complex, C+ said, given all the different nationalities. So I'm not here to tell you that we've got an answer, but it helps that each individual event is a very small crime, $73 at current exchange rates, under the radar as far as serious criminal prosecution is concerned. I have a headache already, Richard said. Is there anything you actually need me to do, or are you just cluing you in, C+ said. I'm sure that the PR staff will want some quality time with you before you go on the road. They just want to tell me to shut up, Richard said. I already know that. That is not the actual point. They just want to be seen as having done their jobs. Richard fell silent for a while, wondering whether there was any way that he could delegate to an underling all meetings whose sole purpose was for the people he was meeting with to demonstrate that they were doing their jobs. Then he realized he should have just stayed in the Schloss if that was what he really wanted. So those are all the bits I'm going to read, and I think what we'll do, thanks. Thanks, son. And we can switch over to question and answer mode now. And where are we on time? Who's my timekeeper? 20 minutes left, okay. Try to get to you as, go ahead, yeah.
Hi. In the past decade, we've seen a lot of books and works that have been hailed as unfilmable, transcribed to film, some successfully, some less so. If you could pick one of your books to be filmed, which would you choose and why?
Is it talking about a movie, a 2-hour feature film? I would just pick the shortest one, which is Zodiac, just because the whole problem with that process is fitting a novel, even a short novel, into a 2-hour movie. Obviously it would be super cool to see Snow Crash on film. Maybe it'll happen one day, but it's just all of the stuff I've written in the last several years is too big and might work as a kind of long-form quality miniseries, but wouldn't really work as a movie. Thanks.
Hey, coming at Reamde as a Warcraft player, your treatment of terrain seems, I guess, plausible and informed. And my question is that coming as a result of kind of detailed writerly research or of actually playing MMOs?
I just did some playing. I mean, I don't have like a really powerful character or anything like that, but mainly because I don't like group play. I just like to go out my own. And that places a pretty low ceiling on how far you can really get. But, enough to sort of get a general sense of how things work in those games. Thanks. I'm just going to alternate between the...
Have you ever been in an airport or a train or just somewhere out in public and seen somebody reading one of your books, and how do you react? And did you react at all, or did you say hi?
Yeah, it doesn't happen a lot. It's happened maybe a couple times in my life. Mostly I just want to cover my face and run away. I want to disturb them, right? So, I mean, I know that people are out there reading them because people come to things like this. So, but statistically, it appears to be a very unlikely event. Yeah, thanks.
A theme of a lot of your books seems to be literacy versus illiteracy,
Okay.
especially in Anathem, and with some of the younger characters in Reamde as well. I was wondering if you're making a point or just an observation.
So I have to tell you that because of the way the speakers are set up, I'm having trouble hearing people, but which must seem odd to you because it's aimed at your head. But it's something about literacy versus illiteracy, and
Right. A lot of your books seem to make a point about people who read and people who are illiterate or illiterate.
yeah.
And I was wondering if you're trying to make a point or just an observation.
Well, I mean, I think that trying to make a point is kind of the highway to hell as far as storytelling is concerned. So I try to avoid feeling like I'm doing that. I think that it's fair game to sort of observe that that those two categories exist, and that they sort of tend to think and behave differently, and to sort of speculate about what that means. You know, how do you set up a society in which that is the case and is going to continue to be the case forever? So, you know, I'm not above trying to address it in a story, but if you ever catch me trying to make points, please bring it to my attention, because, yeah, thanks. Hi.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, just go for it.
So, closer. I have kind of a question and a half. The real question is, given how things like film and comic books started off as just popular entertainment, and then they evolved into, you know, art forms that, you know, move people and are studied. Do you see video games becoming literature, basically? Do you see them with that potential? And my second question is just, how do you pronounce the name of that island that starts with a Q that you made up?
Well, I can't pronounce it because I didn't grow up there, but the way that English people mispronounce it is Tagum, which doesn't sound anything like the way it's really pronounced. But if you say that to someone who's from there, they'll understand that you're butchering the name of their island. As for the first part, the phenomenon you're talking about is well on its way to happening. It's hard to envision what it's going to mean for a video game to be, you know, a serious work of art. Because it's going to be very different. I think of everything in terms of literature, obviously, and you know, what makes a book into a good work of art. And certainly some of that goes into a good video game. You want good writing, you want a good world, but there's other parts of it that are kind of beyond my competence. So, you know, I think that it's going to have something to do with the fact that in a video game you can present a world. And there's a commonality between that and what happens in fantasy and science fiction writing, which tends to be about, here's this world I invented. Now I'm going to tell you a story that happens in that world, but it's implied that many, many other stories in that same world could be told if there were time to write them all down. So that's the link between video games and fantasy and science fiction. I think limitations on technology have prevented them so far from really doing more fully realized worlds. And part of what's going on in Reamde is I'm just sort of pretending that those technological barriers don't exist and saying, well, what if you could do a bigger and more complete world? Thanks.
In
Yeah.
Snow Crash, you wrote about a fictional futuristic environment.
Yep.
And in Reamde, clearly you're writing about something that's much like a traditional online game. At least now it's traditional.
Yeah.
What has that kind of transition felt like to you?
Well, it's just Snow Crash is set in the future, albeit the near future of that world. It's more extrapolative. It's what might things look like in the future, and and this isn't, right? So I think I've been hearing from some people who think that I'm attempting to make a big prediction here. that wasn't what I was trying to do with Snow Crash. I was just trying to write a story, and it's kind of the same deal here. And so I guess I would encourage people not to overinterpret this game in the book. It's just a kind of a plot device that's meant to seem like something that could actually exist one day. So we're down to a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to kind of do quick hits here, I'm afraid.
Okay, so Richard Waterhouse has some internal monologues in Cryptonomicon about his role as an IT administrator in a university and how that contrasts with the somewhat silly roles of the professors of humanities, and he's a real doer and they're the thinkers. And then that theme is expanded in Anathem with the cast, the Ita. So did you have a traumatic experience as a university IT administrator?
Well, I don't think that those two are comparable, since the thinkers, the philosophers, and so on in Anathem are, they are doers. They're pretty cool people. They're not just. I mean, there's a spectrum of people in any academic setting that range from kind of the engineering faculty, out to people who do more kind of humanities-based stuff, and I'm personally glad they're all there. I'm not trying to make blanket statements about who deserves to be teaching in a university, but I hope that in Anathem you're seeing some kind of more abstract thinking academics who are actually ass kickers, and not just kind of there like that. Thanks. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I've bought all of your books and read them, but first I've listened to them on tape or on
great.
CD, and
Okay.
I just wanted to give you feedback that they are tremendous to listen to, and that
Oh,
is
good.
a fabulous form of experience.
Well, you might be interested to know that in this one, because of the recent audiobooks, which they've done a really nice job with, I actually changed the way I do stuff. It's been my habit in the past to throw in footnotes and little diagrams and equations and stuff that is fun on the page but hard to read out loud. And this one is 100% read out loud compatible. Thanks.
Hi, you're known as a science fiction writer who's now written a straight thriller, and a lot of literary writers now incorporate a lot of science fiction elements into their stories. Kurt Vonnegut once said the problem with being in a drawer called science fiction is critics mistake it for a urinal. Who do you think has more success crossing genres that way?
Well, the drawer is gone. Okay, there's no more drawers. Instead, we've got things like Comic Con. Okay, and the critics have been, I think, reduced to a pretty small corner of what really matters. I mean, it's good to have literary critics and to have that as part of our conversation about literature, but I think that the power and the sort of terror that they might have once held over a Kurt Vonnegut or a struggling young New York literary fiction writer 30 years ago just isn't there anymore. I mean, it's all about reaching the audience directly, and you can do that through the kind of fan community and online and everything else. So it's kind of, who cares? Thanks.
I'll make this one quick.
Okay.
Mongoliad, 1 year in.
Yeah.
Are you happy with how it's evolved?
Yeah. No, he's referring to a serialized novel that we've been publishing on the internet on a subscription basis. So it's a great, big, complicated book, a historical action book, co-written by 7 authors, and you can sort of consult the internet for more concerning the Mongoliad. But yeah, it's been a great experiment. We've learned a lot that I hope we can turn around and apply to future projects.
I have 2 questions about the mechanics of how you write your books. First of all, do you listen to music while you write? And second of all, do you use a word processor?
Sometimes I listen to music that's appropriate to the thing I'm writing. For this one, I didn't, for various reasons. So sometimes yes, sometimes no. For the previous 4 novels, I wrote them in longhand with a fountain pen, but this one I wrote using a word processor called Scrivener, and it didn't seem to make much difference. So,
Baroque Cycle, set mostly in the past, Cryptonomicon a little bit. Can we expect anything else in that vein? They're so meticulously researched.
Historical fiction. I love doing that stuff. I'd love to do more of it. I probably will do more of it. It's not what I'm doing at the moment, but I mean the problem is there's a big. It's what they call NREs, right? Non-recoverable expenses that you have to plow into getting up to speed on a particular historical era. And I've done that for the Baroque era. I've got all the notes, got all the books. I could go back to that at any time. But to jump to another, to be like a Time Lord, and go to Rome or something, it would require another big investment of time. So maybe yes, maybe no. Not sure yet. Okay, we're in overtime. I'll just take one more real quick.
Thanks, Neal. The word from Venezuela State Television is that President Chavez intends to repatriate $11 billion worth of gold reserves, most of which are now in London.
I can't hear what you're saying, sorry.
From Venezuela, President Chavez intends to repatriate $11 billion worth of gold reserves. Any comments on the logistics of that kind of a transfer?
I'm not somebody who's really competent to have an opinion about it, but it's an interesting factoid. Thanks for mentioning it. Yeah. I owe somebody a book. Yeah. And I think I'm done. So thank you for coming out.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.